I am Maya. I am 31 years old and I recently learned that blood does not make a family, it just makes a mess. Last Thanksgiving, my parents hosted a lavish dinner to celebrate their fabricated high society image. When I placed my ultrasound photo on the dining table expecting a brief moment of joy, my own mother lunged across the crystal centerpieces and punched me directly in the stomach. She demanded I get rid of the baby so my golden child sister could have the first family heir. What she did not know was that I had orchestrated a little surprise of my own. Before I tell you how a single piece of paper destroyed a fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you believe toxic family members deserve exactly what they have coming to them. The dining room of my parents' mansion in Buckhead, Atlanta was suffocating. The air smelled of expensive roasted turkey and the overwhelming floral perfume my mother Vivian bathed herself in. For 31 years, I had played the role of the quiet disappointment in the Montgomery family. My mother and my father Calvin built a real estate enterprise that afforded them immense wealth and an obsession with their social standing. They expected perfection. Or rather, they expected perfection from my older sister Lila. Layla was 33 and the undisputed golden child. She sat across from me at the massive mahogany table, crossing her legs perfectly smoothing the fabric of her designer dress. Next to her sat her husband Spencer. Spencer was 36, a white man, who desperately projected an image of old money wealth despite his clearly insecure nature. He constantly swirled a glass of expensive bourbon looking at me with undisguised contempt. The tension at the table was a familiar physical weight. I had spent my entire life being measured against Layla and coming up drastically short in my parents' eyes. I was the scapegoat, the one whose achievements were ignored while Layla was celebrated for simply existing. But tonight, I carried a secret that I thought might finally earn me a fraction of their love. I reached into my handbag and pulled out a small glossy photograph. My hands trembled slightly as I placed the ultrasound image on the pristine white tablecloth right next to my untouched dinner plate. I took a deep breath, preparing to announce that I was 12 weeks pregnant. I expected surprise, perhaps a polite congratulation. I did not expect violence. My mother Vivian did not even look at the image closely. Her eyes locked onto the undeniable shape of a baby on the ultrasound, and her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. She did not hesitate. Without a word, she lunged across the table, knocking over a crystal wine glass. The red liquid spilled across the white linen like a warning. Her fist connected directly with my lower abdomen. The physical impact was shocking. The breath left my lungs in a violent rush, and I doubled over, gasping for air. My chair tipped backward, and I collapsed onto the hardwood floor, holding my stomach in absolute terror. The physical pain was sharp, but the emotional shock was entirely paralyzing. My own mother had just struck a pregnant woman. I curled into a defensive position on the floor, waiting for my father to intervene or for someone to help me. Nobody moved to help. The room was deathly quiet for a fraction of a second before the screaming began. "Are you out of your mind?" Vivian shrieked, stepping over the spilled wine to stand above me. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings, piercing my ringing ears. "You need to get rid of it right now. Layla and Spencer are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on fertility treatments. The first grandchild of this family, the first heir to the Montgomery name, must be hers. It has to be her child to secure our elite status in this city. You are just doing this to steal her spotlight again. Are you planning to raise some illegitimate child to drag our reputation through the mud?" I looked up through my blurred vision. Layla did not look horrified by our mother committing assault. She was actually smirking. She leaned back in her chair, looking down at me with a sickening sense of satisfaction. Spencer took another slow sip of his bourbon, his eyes cold and mocking. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Your mother is right, Maya," he sneered, his voice dripping with arrogant privilege. We are preparing to bring a child into a life of real wealth and stability. Do not ruin our moment with your pathetic attempts for attention." My father Calvin sat at the head of the table, silent and complicit, choosing his precious social image over his injured daughter on the floor. I did not cry. The tears I might have shed for a loving family dried up instantly. The time for playing the obedient victim was completely over. I slowly pulled myself up from the hardwood floor, smoothing my dress. I reached down, grabbed a linen napkin, and calmly wiped the cold sweat from my forehead. I looked directly at Spencer, offering him a chilling, empty smile. "Are you entirely sure you still have hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend on anything, Spencer?" I asked quietly. His arrogant smirk faltered. He opened his mouth to shout at me, but the words never came. A sudden explosion of red and blue lights illuminated the large dining room windows, casting frantic shadows across the walls. The sound of heavy tires screeching to a halt on the gravel driveway shattered the suburban silence. A loud mechanical voice boomed through a megaphone outside, echoing into the house. "Spencer Hayes, we know you are inside. This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are executing a search warrant for this property. Open the door immediately." My mother went completely pale, dropping her wineglass. Before anyone could move, a massive battering ram smashed against the solid oak front door, tearing it from its hinges with a deafening crash. The night was just getting started. I am Maya, 31 years old, and until last Thanksgiving, I was the designated scapegoat of my wealthy family. My parents worshipped my sister Layla, treating her like a queen while dismissing my existence. When I finally revealed my pregnancy at our holiday dinner, I expected a brief moment of joy. Instead, my own mother lunged across the table and punched me directly in the stomach, screaming that her golden child must have the first heir. What she did not know was that I had orchestrated a surprise of my own. Before I explain how I destroyed their fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you believe toxic family members deserve exactly what they have coming to them. The dining room of my parents' mansion in Buckhead, Atlanta, was suffocating. The air smelled of expensive roasted turkey and the overwhelming floral perfume my mother Vivian bathed herself in. For 31 years, I had played the role of the quiet disappointment in the Montgomery family. My mother and my father Calvin built a real estate enterprise that afforded them immense wealth and an obsession with their social standing. They expected perfection, or rather they expected perfection from my older sister Layla. Layla was 33 and the undisputed golden child. She sat across from me at the massive mahogany table, crossing her legs perfectly, smoothing the fabric of her designer dress. Next to her sat her husband, Spencer. Spencer was 36. A white man who desperately projected an image of old money wealth. Despite his clearly insecure nature, he constantly swirled a glass of expensive bourbon, looking at me with undisguised contempt. The tension at the table was a familiar physical weight I had spent my entire life being measured against Layla, and coming up drastically short in my parents' eyes. I was the scapegoat, the one whose achievements were ignored while Layla was celebrated for simply existing. But tonight, I carried a secret that I thought might finally earn me a fraction of their love. I reached into my handbag and pulled out a small, glossy photograph. My hands trembled slightly as I placed the ultrasound image on the pristine white tablecloth, right next to my untouched dinner plate. I took a deep breath, preparing to announce that I was 12 weeks pregnant. I expected surprise. Perhaps a polite congratulation. I did not expect violence. My mother, Vivian, did not even look at the image closely. Her eyes locked onto the undeniable shape of a baby on the ultrasound, and her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. She did not hesitate. Without a word, she lunged across the table, knocking over a crystal wine glass. The red liquid spilled across the white linen like a warning. Her fist connected directly with my lower abdomen. The physical impact was shocking. The breath left my lungs in a violent rush, and I doubled over, gasping for air. My chair tipped backward, and I collapsed onto the hardwood floor, holding my stomach in absolute terror. The physical pain was sharp, but the emotional shock was entirely paralyzing. My own mother had just struck a pregnant woman. I curled into a defensive position on the floor, waiting for my father to intervene, or for someone to help me. Nobody moved to help. The room was deathly quiet for a fraction of a second before the screaming began. "Are you out of your mind?" Vivian shrieked, stepping over the spilled wine to stand above me. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings, piercing my ringing ears. "You need to get rid of it right now." Layla and Spencer are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on fertility treatments. The first grandchild of this family, the first heir to the Montgomery name, must be hers. It has to be her child to secure our elite status in this city. You are just doing this to steal her spotlight again. Are you planning to raise some illegitimate child to drag our reputation through the mud? I looked up through my blurred vision. Layla did not look horrified by our mother committing assault. She was actually smirking. She leaned back in her chair, looking down at me with a sickening sense of satisfaction. Spencer took another slow sip of his bourbon, his eyes cold and mocking. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Your mother is right, Maya," he sneered, his voice dripping with arrogant privilege. "We are preparing to bring a child into a life of real wealth and stability. Do not ruin our moment with your pathetic attempts for attention." My father. Calvin sat at the head of the table, silent and complicit, choosing his precious social image over his injured daughter on the floor. I did not cry. The tears I might have shed for a loving family dried up instantly. The time for playing the obedient victim was completely over. I slowly pulled myself up from the hardwood floor, smoothing my dress. I reached down, grabbed a linen napkin, and calmly wiped the cold sweat from my forehead. I looked directly at Spencer, offering him a chilling, empty smile. "Are you entirely sure you still have hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend on anything, Spencer?" I asked quietly. His arrogant smirk faltered. He opened his mouth to shout at me, but the words never came. A sudden explosion of red and blue lights illuminated the large dining room windows, casting frantic shadows across the walls. The sound of heavy tires screeching to a halt on the gravel driveway shattered the suburban silence. A loud, mechanical voice boomed through a megaphone outside, echoing into the house. "Spencer Hayes, we know you are inside. This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are executing a search warrant for this property. Open the door immediately." My mother went completely pale, dropping her wineglass. Before anyone could move, a massive battering ram smashed against the solid oak front door, tearing it from its hinges with a deafening crash. The night was just getting started, and I was finally ready to sit back and watch their completely fake, miserable empire burn to the ground. The silence that followed Julian's words was heavier than the humid Atlanta air outside. My father froze, his mouth slightly open, his eyes darting between my husband and me, as if trying to translate a foreign language. My mother, still clutching the edge of the dining table with trembling fingers, looked at me like I had grown a second head. For 10 years, this family had operated on a very specific set of assumptions. To them, I was Maya the mediocre. Maya, the low-level bank teller, who sat behind bulletproof glass cashing checks for people far more important than her. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, heavy file folder stamped with the official seal of the United States Department of the Treasury. I dropped it onto the dining table right next to the spilled wine and the cold roasted turkey. The loud thud made my mother flinch. "I am not a bank teller," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of the deference I had been forced to perform my entire life. "For the past decade, I have been a senior forensic accountant for the federal government. My division tracks dark money, offshore tax evasion, and large-scale financial fraud. And for the last 18 months, my primary target has been Montgomery Capital Holdings." My father staggered backward, bumping into the antique credenza. He looked at the federal file, and then at Spencer, waiting for his golden son-in-law to laugh this off as a ridiculous prank. But Spencer was not laughing. The arrogant smirk had completely melted off his face, replaced by a pasty, sickly terror. The designer suit he wore suddenly looked like a cheap costume. "You see, Spencer," I continued, walking slowly toward the head of the table. "You made a very careless mistake. You assumed that because my family treated me like an invisible peasant, I actually was one. You assumed no one would ever look closely at those shell companies you set up in the Cayman Islands, because you masked them behind my father's legitimate real estate firm. You thought you were brilliant. But tracing your stolen funds was actually the easiest assignment of my entire career. You did not build a hedge fund. You built a sloppy, desperate Ponzi scheme, stealing from honest local investors to fund your country club memberships and imported luxury cars." Layla finally snapped out of her shock. Her perfectly manicured hands balled into tight fists, her face turning an ugly shade of crimson. She lunged forward, though she kept a safe distance from the federal agent standing near the doorway. "You are lying!" Layla screamed, her voice cracking with pure venom. "You fabricated this entire thing because you are sick with jealousy. You have always been jealous of me, Maya. Ever since we were kids, you resented the fact that Mom and Dad actually loved me. You are doing this to destroy my marriage because you are so miserable in your own pathetic life." She pointed a shaking finger at my face, her voice growing more hysterical by the second. "You never got over the fact that Mom and Dad paid for my gap year in Paris while you were stuck working night shifts at some cheap diner to pay for your state school tuition. You could never stand that I married into old money while you settled for a government worker. You just wanted to humiliate us. You wanted to ruin my perfect life forever." I looked at my sister. There was no sadness left in my heart for her, no sibling bond to appeal to. She was completely consumed by the toxic vanity our parents had fed her since birth. "I paid my own state school tuition, Layla," I replied, my tone icy and calm. "I paid it by working double shifts, so I would never have to owe our parents a single dime. I paid my own way so they could not hold their conditional love over my head the way they do to you." I took a step closer, staring directly into her panicked eyes. "And as for your perfect life, I just paid for your husband's one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary." Spencer let out a strangled gasp as two federal agents stepped forward, grabbing his arms and forcing them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the dining room was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Spencer struggled wildly, losing every ounce of that refined, upper-class composure he loved to project. He looked like a cornered animal, desperate and terrified. "Wait! Stop! You cannot do this!" he yelled, his voice cracking as an agent read him his rights. "I am a victim here too. I did not do this alone. I promise you I am innocent." My father stepped forward, holding his hands up in a pleading gesture. "Spencer, son, stay calm. We will hire the best defense team in the state. We will clear this up immediately. Do not say another word to these people." But Spencer was not looking at my father. He was staring directly at Layla. The cowardice that had always lived just beneath his polished exterior finally broke through completely. If he was going down, he was not going to take the fall by himself. The grand illusion of their perfect marriage shattered in an instant. "Do not just arrest me," Spencer shouted, twisting his head to look at the lead FBI agent. "I am not the only one. Look at the corporate filings. I did not sign those offshore account transfers. I do not have authorization for the Cayman accounts." "She does." He thrust his chin in Layla's direction, his face twisted in desperate betrayal. "Layla signed the documents. She is the shell company director. She authorized the wire transfers to pay off her own private debts. Arrest her too." The golden child stood completely frozen, her eyes wide with absolute horror, as she realized her own husband had just thrown her directly under the bus. The federal agents immediately turned their attention from the sweating, pathetic coward in handcuffs toward my older sister, and the entire room held its breath, waiting for her fake kingdom to come crashing down. The two federal agents did not hesitate. As Spencer pointed his shaking finger at his wife, the agents pivoted smoothly toward Layla. The smug satisfaction that had rested on her face just moments ago vanished entirely. She stumbled backward until her designer heels hit the edge of the mahogany credenza. Her perfectly styled hair fell into her eyes as she raised her hands in a futile attempt to ward off the approaching officers. She stammered out denials, but the agents were already reciting her Miranda rights, gripping her arms with the exact same clinical precision they had used on her husband. My mother completely lost her mind. Vivian let out a sound that was half shriek and half sob. She rushed forward, grabbing the sleeve of the nearest FBI agent, only to be forcefully shoved back by another officer who warned her about interfering with a federal arrest. Vivian spun around to face me, her chest heaving as a full-blown panic attack set in. Her face was streaked with running mascara, completely destroying her carefully crafted high society image. "Maya, you have to stop them!" She hyperventilated, clutching her throat. "You work for the government. You can fix this. Tell them it is a mistake. Tell them your sister is a good person. You cannot let them take my baby away in handcuffs. You are her sister, Maya. Do something right now." I looked at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had violently punched my pregnant stomach less than an hour ago to protect the very daughter now sobbing in federal custody. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. "I cannot stop a federal indictment, Mother," I replied, my voice echoing clearly across the chaotic dining room. "And even if I could, I would not lift a single finger to help a woman who steals from her own family." Layla stopped struggling against the agents for a fraction of a second, her tear-streaked face whipping toward me. Vivian stopped gasping and stared at me in pure confusion. I reached back into my leather tote bag and pulled out a secondary file. I opened it and removed a thick stack of printed bank statements, tossing them onto the dining table so they scattered across the spilled wine and expensive china. "Since we are airing out all the dirty laundry tonight," I said, looking directly at my mother, "we should probably address the elephant in the room. You punched me because you demanded that Layla have the first Montgomery heir. You were perfectly fine with assaulting your own flesh and blood because you believed Layla and Spencer were going through grueling, expensive medical procedures to give you a grandchild." I picked up the top bank statement and held it up. "But Layla has never set foot inside a fertility clinic in her entire life. She is not undergoing IVF treatments. She never was." Vivian shook her head in frantic denial. "That is impossible. I went to the bank with her. I transferred $150,000 directly from my retirement savings into her medical fund just 2 months ago to cover the out-of-network specialist fees." She showed me the clinic brochures. "She showed you downloaded files from a random website," I corrected smoothly. "That $150,000 never went to a doctor. It went straight into the pockets of a very dangerous underground gambling syndicate operating out of an illegal casino downtown. Layla has a severe gambling addiction. She has been drowning in debt for years. When the loan sharks threatened to break her legs, she needed a massive influx of cash fast. So she faked a heartbreaking infertility journey to extort her own mother's retirement fund." Layla let out a guttural scream, trying to lunge at me, but the federal agents held her firmly in place. "You ruined my life!" she shrieked, her mask of perfection entirely obliterated. "You ruined your own life," I fired back. "You did not want Spencer's baby. You never wanted a child at all. You only married Spencer because you thought he was a self-made millionaire who could fund your lavish lifestyle and pay off your gambling markers. You thought you hit the jackpot. But the absolute best part of this entire miserable tragedy is that you two artists actually conned each other." I looked over at Spencer, who was standing in handcuffs staring at his wife in absolute disgust. Layla thought Spencer had endless capital, but Spencer was dead broke and running a Ponzi scheme. Spencer married Layla because he thought our parents would fund his fraudulent hedge fund to keep their precious daughter living in luxury. You were two parasites feeding off a host that was rapidly bleeding dry. You deserve each other perfectly." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of Layla's ragged breathing and the distant crackle of the police radios outside. But the night was not over. The final blow had not yet landed. A strange, wet, gasping sound broke the quiet. Everyone turned to look at the head of the table. My father. Calvin had not spoken a word since the federal agents breached the front door. He had stood frozen like a statue, watching his golden daughter and his wealthy son-in-law be exposed as federal criminals. Now his face was the color of ash, His hands flew to his chest as his knees buckled. He stumbled backward, knocking over his heavy wooden dining chair, and collapsed heavily onto the floor. "Calvin!" Vivian screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. My father did not look at his wife. He did not look at his favorite daughter being led toward the door in handcuffs. He looked up at me, and for the very first time in my 31 years of life, I saw sheer, unadulterated terror in my father's eyes. His lips trembled, and he struggled to pull air into his lungs. "Maya," he wheezed, his voice frail and broken. "Maya, the house, the business." He gripped the edge of the tablecloth, pulling it down slightly. "I remortgaged everything," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. Yet it echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "I signed the paperwork last month. I took out a second mortgage on this mansion. I leveraged the entire commercial real estate portfolio. I liquidated every single asset we had." Vivian froze her hands, hovering over my father's chest. "What are you talking about, Calvin?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "I gave the cash to Spencer." My father sobbed, tears finally spilling down his wrinkled cheeks. He promised me a guaranteed 40% return. He told me I would be a senior partner in the hedge fund. I gave him everything we own. The gravity of his confession settled over the room like a physical weight. The millions of dollars my parents had spent their entire lives accumulating, the wealth they used to bludgeon me into submission, the high society status they valued above their own daughter was completely gone. Spencer's fake hedge fund had swallowed it all whole, and the federal government was about to seize whatever pennies were left. The Montgomery family was not just publicly disgraced, they were officially bankrupt and entirely homeless. The sun rose over Atlanta the next morning, casting a cold and indifferent light on the absolute wreckage of my family's legacy. By 9 o'clock, my phone was buzzing with frantic updates. Layla was officially out on bail, her wealthy facade traded for a cheap sweatsuit and a looming federal court date. My parents suddenly stripped of their arrogance, and their bank accounts were utterly desperate. I had sent my father a single text message with an address and a time. 10 o'clock sharp. I knew exactly what they expected when they saw the location. They probably thought I lived in some cramped, neglected apartment fitting the pathetic image they had painted of me for over a decade. When their battered luxury sedan, the only asset the federal agents had not immediately frozen, pulled up to the towering glass and steel high-rise in the center of Midtown, I watched them from above. The concierge, a man who knew exactly who I was, greeted them with practiced neutrality and guided them toward the private gold-trimmed elevator. The heavy doors opened directly into my living room, revealing a sprawling $6 million penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. Pristine white marble floors caught the morning sunlight, and original curated artwork lined the walls. I stood near the massive quartz kitchen island, sipping a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice, wearing a tailored silk maternity blouse. I watched their jaws practically hit the marble floor. My father stepped out of the elevator first, his eyes darting wildly around the massive space, taking in the crystal chandeliers and the private wrap-around terrace. He looked like a man who had just woken up on another planet. My mother trailed behind him, her usual pristine appearance completely shattered. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes were bloodshot from a night of crying. But the moment she saw the sheer wealth surrounding me, her predatory survival instincts immediately kicked back in. It took Vivian exactly 10 seconds to completely rewrite reality. The woman who had physically assaulted me the night before, who had screamed that my unborn child was an illegitimate burden, suddenly plastered on a sickeningly sweet smile. She rushed forward, her hands clasped together in a grotesque display of artificial maternal pride. "Oh, Maya," she gasped, her voice dripping with calculated warmth. "Look at this magnificent place. Look at what you have accomplished. We had absolutely no idea you were hiding all of this incredible success from us." My father quickly joined her performance, straightening his wrinkled jacket and trying to summon the ghost of his former authority. "We always knew you had this kind of potential, Maya," he said, forcing a chuckle that sounded more like a dry cough. "We pushed you hard because we knew you needed that tough love to truly excel. You see, Vivian, our parenting methods worked perfectly. She is rich. I stared at them, letting their absolute delusion hang in the quiet air of the penthouse. It was breathtaking. They were standing in my home entirely bankrupt, their favorite daughter facing federal prison, and they were honestly trying to take credit for my wealth. You pushed me, I repeated slowly, letting the words sink in. You ignored me for 31 years. You treated me like a servant. You punched me in the stomach when I told you I was pregnant. And now you want to claim my success as a parenting victory. Vivian waved her hand dismissively as if my trauma was just a minor scheduling conflict she could brush away. Oh, darling, do not dwell on the past, she said, stepping closer and attempting to place a hand on my arm. I took a sharp step back, my eyes flashing a clear warning. She cleared her throat and shifted her strategy, her voice taking on a desperate pleading tone. We are family, Maya, and right now, your sister needs you. Layla is terrified. The lawyers are demanding an astronomical retainer just to keep her out of a federal holding cell. The government froze all of Spencer's accounts. Calvin nodded eagerly, stepping up beside his wife. We are completely tapped out, Maya. The business is gone. The mansion is going to be seized by the bank before the end of the month. But you have this incredible asset right here. He gestured broadly around the penthouse. You could list this property today. With the Atlanta real estate market booming, it would sell in a week. You can use the cash to pay back Spencer's victims. If you cover the stolen funds, the prosecutors might offer Layla a plea deal for probation. You can save your sister from going to jail. I looked back and forth between the two people who were supposed to protect me from the moment I was born. They were actually asking me to sell my home to render myself and my unborn child homeless, just to bail out the sister who had happily watched my mother abuse me. They wanted me to clean up the catastrophic mess created by their own toxic greed. Be a good daughter, Maya Vivian pleaded, her voice taking on that familiar demanding edge she had used my entire life. Do the right thing. It is just a piece of real estate. You can always buy another one later. Lila is your own flesh and blood. A low chuckle started deep in my chest. It bubbled up into my throat until I threw my head back and laughed out loud. The sound echoed off the high ceilings, sharp and entirely devoid of humor. My parents exchanged a nervous, confused glance. They did not understand why I was not falling into line. They still thought they held some kind of invisible authority over my life. I stopped laughing and slammed my glass down onto the quartz island. The sharp crack made my father flinch. Sell it? I asked, a wicked, chilling smile spreading across my face. Do you really think I am just some lucky girl who managed to buy a nice apartment? You still have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. I walked slowly around the island, closing the distance between us, until I was standing inches from my father's pale, terrified face. I do not just own this penthouse, Mother. I own the entire development group that built this building. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. My father stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land. The reality of my wealth washed over him. But instead of humility or remorse, I saw the familiar, rigid posture of the Montgomery patriarch return to his shoulders. He adjusted his collar and lifted his chin, attempting to look down his nose at me, despite standing in a living room that cost more than his entire failing commercial portfolio. Then he acted like absolutely nothing had changed. Maya, you will transfer the necessary capital into the Montgomery holding accounts immediately, he commanded, his voice booming across the open concept living space. You will contact your financial officers and authorize a wire transfer to cover Spencer's deficit so we can post Layla's secondary bail and hire the best defense team in Atlanta. I am your father, and I am telling you to save this family right now. You owe us for giving you the drive to succeed. I stared at the man who had ignored my entire existence. He honestly believed my money belonged to him simply because we shared the same last name. He thought he could snap his fingers, and I would eagerly empty my bank accounts to rescue the sister who had made my life a living nightmare. Before I could even formulate a response to his breathtaking audacity, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed from the hallway leading to the master suite. My husband Julian walked into the sunlit living room. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, his expression calm, but completely lethal. He did not look at my parents with anger. He looked at them with the cold, clinical detachment of a man studying a particularly disgusting insect. In his right hand, he held a small black digital audio recorder. Julian stopped beside the kitchen island and placed his free hand gently on the small of my back, a silent gesture of unwavering support. I believe, Calvin, that you are operating under a severe misconception, Julian said, his voice smooth and commanding. You seem to think your precious daughter Lila actually cares about you or your business. You think she is a victim who needs to be rescued by Maya's hard-earned capital. Vivian puffed out her chest, taking a step toward my husband. How dare you speak about Layla that way? She shrieked, her face turning a mottled shade of crimson. Layla loves this family. She made a mistake because she was under pressure, but she would never intentionally hurt us. She is a loyal Montgomery, unlike the ungrateful daughter standing right next to you. Julian did not argue. He simply offered a cold, tight smile and raised the digital recorder. As a senior forensic accountant, Maya had access to a vast network of federal resources during the 18-month investigation into Spencer's fraudulent hedge fund, he explained calmly. This included court-ordered wiretaps on Spencer's personal and business cell phones. We thought you might want to hear a specific conversation recorded just 3 weeks ago. Julian pressed the play button. The audio quality was crystal clear, filling the quiet penthouse. Spencer's panicked voice echoed from the small speaker. The investors are asking for their quarterly dividends. Layla, we are out of time. If we do not get an injection of cash, the federal regulators are going to start knocking on my door. Then came Lila's voice, bored and dripping with irritation. Relax, Spencer. I told you I have a plan. My father is practically senile anyway. He forgot where he parked his car twice last month. We just need to accelerate the timeline. What timeline? Spencer's voice crackled through the speaker, sounding frantic. The medical power of Attorney Layla's voice replied, cold and calculating. I already spoke to a lawyer. We are going to legally declare Calvin mentally unfit to manage his own assets. Once I have conservatorship, I can liquidate the rest of the Montgomery commercial real estate portfolio and transfer the cash directly into your Cayman accounts. If his heart condition acts up from the stress, even better, we can seize his life insurance policy before the company goes entirely under. We will take every last dime and leave him in a cheap nursing home. He will never even know what hit him. Julian pressed the stop button. The silence that rushed back into the room was deafening. I watched my father physically crumble. The booming, arrogant patriarch who had just demanded my money withered into a broken old man right before my eyes. He staggered backward, clutching his chest, just as he had the night before, his breathing shallow and ragged. The golden child he had worshipped his entire life. The daughter he had bankrupted himself to protect had been actively plotting to steal his company, have him declared legally insane, and leave him to die in a cheap facility. Calvin sank onto one of the white leather bar stools, burying his face in his trembling hands. A low, wounded sob escaped his throat. Vivian, however, refused to accept the reality staring her directly in the face. She shook her head violently, her eyes wide and manic. No, she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Julian. No, that is a lie. That is not my daughter. You fabricated that. She turned her wild, aggressive gaze onto me. You did this, Maya. You used some kind of artificial intelligence program to fake Layla's voice. You created a deepfake audio file because you are so consumed with jealousy. You have always wanted to destroy my relationship with Layla, and now you are making up these sick, disgusting lies to turn your father against her. You are a monster, Maya. I just stared at her, marveling at the depth of her delusion. She was standing in a $6 million penthouse, listening to federal wiretap evidence, and she still chose to believe Layla was a saint. There was absolutely no reasoning with a woman who had completely divorced herself from reality to protect her favorite child. You can lie to yourself all you want, Mother, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. But the federal prosecutors have that audio file. It is going to be played in open court. Everyone in Atlanta will know exactly what Layla planned to do to her own father. Vivian let out a sharp, hysterical laugh that sent a chill down my spine. She reached into her oversized designer handbag and aggressively pulled out a thick manila folder. She slapped the folder down onto the quartz kitchen island right next to my glass of orange juice. Her eyes were burning with a toxic, triumphant gleam. "You think you have won, Maya?" she snarled, leaning over the island to glare at me. "You think because you have this fancy penthouse and your little federal job that you hold all the cards, but you forgot something very important." She tapped her manicured fingernails against the manila folder. "When your grandmother Eleanor passed away 10 years ago, she set up a private trust fund specifically for you. She knew we did not see eye to eye, so she locked away a massive inheritance that you could not touch until you turned 35. You are only 31. Maya." Vivian snatched the folder up and waved it in my face, her smile stretching into something truly malicious. "You forgot that I am still the legal executor of your grandmother's trust. I have full authorization to manage those assets until your 35th birthday. And since we are officially bankrupt, I am going to drain every single penny of your inheritance right now. I will use your grandmother's money to hire the most ruthless defense attorneys in the country. I will drain your entire future to save Layla, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop me." I did not flinch. I stood perfectly still and watched Vivian wave the manila document like a weapon in the sunlit penthouse. The heavy paper slapped against the marble countertop, but the sound did not make me blink. Julian remained standing right beside me, his hand resting a warm, steady weight against my back. For my entire life, that exact folder had been the ultimate instrument of control. Vivian had held my grandmother's trust fund over my head like a guillotine waiting to drop. Serve the family. Maya, she used to hiss at me before every miserable social event. Smile and make your sister look good. Or I will ensure you never see a single dime of Eleanor's money. She used it to force me into submission, making me work double shifts at cheap diners just to survive while she held millions hostage. She loved the power it gave her. She loved knowing she held the keys to my financial freedom, and she fully intended to never hand them over. But standing there now, looking at the wild, desperate hope burning in my mother's eyes, I felt absolutely nothing. Vivian honestly believed she had just delivered the winning blow. She thought she had found the perfect loophole to save her precious Layla and destroy me in the process. Her chest was heaving and her designer blouse was wrinkled and sweat-stained. She was breathing heavily, clutching the folder with white knuckles, waiting for me to break down and beg. She expected me to fall to my knees and plead with her to spare my inheritance. She wanted me to cry and offer to sell the penthouse instead, just to keep the trust fund intact. "You are holding a piece of useless garbage, Mother," I said, my voice dropping to a low, calm register that finally made her manic smile falter. I looked down at the folder and then back up into her bloodshot eyes. "You are not the legal executor of my trust. You have not been the executor for over 3 years." Vivian stiffened her grip, tightening on the folder until the thick paper creased and bent. "That is impossible," she spat, her voice, shrill and defensive, echoing loudly across the massive, open-concept kitchen. "I never signed any transfer of power. I have the original documents right here. The trust clearly states I maintain absolute control until your 35th birthday. You cannot just magically erase my authority." "Maya, I am your mother, and I dictate where this money goes." "I did not need magic," I replied, taking a slow step forward. "I just needed the United States tax code. When I started working as a senior forensic accountant for the federal government, my very first personal project was digging into my own financial history. I noticed several glaring discrepancies in the tax filings submitted under my name over the past decade. Large capital gains taxes that made absolutely no sense for a low-level bank teller. Massive withdrawals and transfers that triggered federal flags. So I dug deeper. And do you know what I found, Mother? Calvin looked up from his hands, his face pale and sweating profusely. He gripped the edge of the bar stool, trying to steady his trembling frame. Vivian stood completely rigid, refusing to answer me, her eyes darting nervously toward Julian, who simply watched her with icy amusement. I found dozens of forged signatures. I continued, my voice echoing off the glass walls of the penthouse. You forged my name on federal tax documents for years to hide the erratic movements of the trust fund assets. You committed severe tax fraud to maintain your absolute control over my inheritance. So I gathered all the evidence, and I went straight to a federal judge. I held a private hearing and presented the fraudulent documents directly to the court. The judge stripped you of your executorship immediately. You were legally removed 3 years ago, and the bank was ordered to freeze your access. I just decided not to tell you. I let you keep living in your grand delusion, thinking you still held my leash. Vivian opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted wildly toward Calvin, who was now staring at her in absolute horror, realizing his wife had committed federal crimes right under his nose. She looked back at me, her hands trembling so badly she dropped the manila folder onto the floor, where it landed with a pathetic slap against the marble. But the bank statements, she whispered, her voice cracking and weak. I still get the monthly summaries in the mail. The account shows a balance of over $4 million. If I am not the executor, how is the money still there? Julian reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He calmly pulled out a crisp white envelope bearing the official seal of the Primary Wealth Management Bank. He placed it on the quartz island, sliding it directly across the smooth surface until it bumped against Vivian's shaking hand. She flinched as if the paper was burning hot, staring at it like it was a venomous snake. Open it, I commanded, my tone leaving no room for argument. Read the updated portfolio. Vivian's shaking fingers tore at the seal, ripping the thick paper in her haste. She pulled out the official bank documents, pulling them close to her face. She scanned the top page, her eyes moving rapidly across the printed lines. Her breathing grew shallow and erratic. She flipped to the second page, and a strangled choking sound ripped from her throat. She stumbled backward, grabbing her own chest as if she had just been physically struck. Calvin struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the counter for support. What does it say, Vivian? He croaked, his voice raw with pure panic. Tell me what it says. What is the balance? Vivian could not speak. She just stared at the number 0 printed clearly at the bottom of the final page. Her mouth opened and closed in silent agony. I smiled, leaning forward slightly, so she could see the absolute finality in my eyes. Grandma's money is not there anymore, I told her, watching the devastation finally crush her arrogant spirit. You moved it to Spencer's fund 5 years ago without telling me. You thought you were so brilliant. You thought you could illegally transfer my inheritance into Montgomery Capital Holdings, double the money through Spencer's supposed financial genius, and siphon off the profits to pay for Layla's extravagant lifestyle. You wanted to use my money to fund your favorite daughters. Fake empire. Vivian let out a pathetic wailing noise, dropping the papers. They fluttered to the floor, landing right next to her useless manila folder. But you did not know Spencer was running a Ponzi scheme. I continued, driving the final nail into the coffin of her high society life. You dumped $4 million of stolen trust fund money into a fraudulent hedge fund. And where do you think that money went? Mother, it went to pay off Layla's underground gambling debts. It went to buy her imported cars and designer clothes and to fake an entire IVF journey. You stole from me to fund your golden child, and your golden child squandered every single penny. I watched my mother fall to her knees on the pristine white marble floor. She was completely broken, destroyed by her own toxic greed and her blind devotion to a daughter who had manipulated them all. So no, Mother, I said, looking down at her sobbing form. You are not going to hire ruthless defense attorneys for Layla. You are not going to use my inheritance to bail her out because the money is gone. You gave it to a criminal who gave it to a gambling syndicate. You just bankrupted yourself, Mom. The echo of my mother's sobbing was the only sound left in the penthouse. She remained slumped on the white marble, her designer clothes crumpled, her absolute defeat finally cemented. Calvin stood frozen against the kitchen island, looking like a hollow shell of the man who had entered my home just 20 minutes prior. I watched them wallow in the miserable reality they had created for themselves, feeling the steady warmth of Julian's hand on my lower back. I was about to instruct the concierge to escort them out of the building when the private elevator chimed a second time. The heavy, polished doors slid open silently. The two people who stepped into my living room brought an entirely new level of toxicity into the space. It was Spencer's parents, Beatrice and Richard Montgomery. They stepped off the elevator with the terrifying entitlement of old money, their expressions locked into identical masks of aristocratic fury. Beatrice was draped in pristine cashmere, her posture rigid, and her eyes immediately scanning the room with blatant, undisguised disgust. When her gaze landed on my parents, and then on me, her upper lip curled into a sneer. "We demanded the concierge send us up immediately," Beatrice announced, her voice sharp and echoing with generational authority. Richard stood behind her, holding a leather briefcase, looking at my father as if he were something foul he had stepped on in the street. Vivian scrambled to her feet the moment she saw them. Even completely bankrupted and publicly humiliated, my mother could not abandon her desperate need for white proximity. She hurriedly smoothed down her ruined blouse and attempted to reconstruct her high society smile, taking a frantic step toward the Montgomerys. "Beatrice, please." Vivian choked out her voice, trembling with artificial sweetness. "We are so sorry about this entire misunderstanding. We are trying to fix it." Beatrice did not even acknowledge Vivian's outstretched hand. She looked my mother up and down with an expression of pure racial revulsion. "Do not touch me!" Beatrice snapped, her tone slicing through the air like a razor blade. "You and your husband have destroyed my family. We welcomed your daughter into our circle. We allowed Spencer to marry into your completely unremarkable lineage because we believed you were at least respectable. But this is exactly what we should have expected." Beatrice took a step forward, her eyes blazing with raw venom. "You dragged my brilliant, successful son into your pathetic scams. Spencer was building a legitimate financial empire until he got tangled up with you people, you ghetto. Black family con artists used my boy as a shield for your own illegal activities. And now he is sitting in a federal holding cell because of your sloppiness." I felt Julian tense beside me, his jaw locking, but I placed a hand over his. I wanted to see exactly how low my mother would sink. Vivian did not disappoint. Instead of defending her own dignity or throwing Beatrice out of my home, she actually began to grovel. She clasped her hands together, bowing her head submissively to the woman who had just hurled racist insults directly into her face. "It is not our fault." "Beatrice," Vivian pleaded, tears spilling over her mascara-stained cheeks. "We did not do this. It is Maya." She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at me. "Maya works for the federal government. She is a vindictive, hateful girl who orchestrated this entire raid because she is jealous of Layla and Spencer. She set them up to ruin their marriage. She is the one who called the FBI." My father nodded along vigorously, completely, abandoning whatever shreds of self-respect he had left. "Vivian is right." "Richard," Calvin insisted, stepping toward the older man. "We are victims here too. My daughter Maya is the one pulling the strings. She has always been the problem in our family. We will do whatever it takes to clear Spencer's name. We will cooperate with your lawyers entirely." Richard Montgomery let out a cold, dismissive laugh, while Beatrice looked at my parents with absolute contempt. She reached into her imported leather handbag and pulled out a crisp, heavy piece of parchment paper. "You are entirely correct about one thing," Calvin, Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "You will do whatever it takes to clear my son's name." She stepped forward and shoved the paper directly at Vivian. My mother flinched as the document fluttered out of Beatrice's hand and landed face up on the floor between us. "That is an invoice for a $2 million retainer," Beatrice stated, crossing her arms over her cashmere sweater. "We just hired the most ruthless federal defense team in the state of Georgia. They are going to obliterate your daughter's credibility and prove that Spencer was manipulated into signing those offshore wire transfers. You people will pay for my son's defense. You will wire those funds by the end of the business day, or we will personally ensure that Layla rots in a federal penitentiary for the rest of her natural life." Vivian stared down at the invoice, her mouth opening and closing in silent horror. She had just been told she was entirely bankrupt, and now the wealthy white in-laws she worshipped were demanding $2 million she did not possess. I smoothly stepped around the kitchen island, walking right into the center of the standoff. I placed myself directly between my groveling parents and the arrogant Montgomerys. Without breaking eye contact with Beatrice, I slowly bent down and picked up the crisp, legal invoice from the marble floor. I held the crisp, heavy parchment paper in my hands. The $2 million invoice felt thick, a tangible representation of the Montgomery family's staggering arrogance. Beatrice stared at me, her chin tilted up, expecting me to cower. She expected me to do exactly what my mother was currently doing on the floor, shrinking in the presence of white elite wealth. Vivian scrambled to grab the hem of my pants, begging me to apologize, begging me to fix the mess I had supposedly created. I stepped out of her reach, leaving my mother sobbing against the marble. I had absolutely no intention of defending my parents. They had dug their own graves. My focus was entirely on the monsters standing in my foyer. I looked at the invoice, then slowly raised my eyes to meet Beatrice's venomous glare. I tore the thick paper straight down the middle. The sharp ripping sound echoed through the penthouse, making Richard flinch. I placed the torn halves neatly on the kitchen island. "Are you out of your mind?" Richard bellowed, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. He took a threatening step forward, raising his leather briefcase as if to emphasize his authority. "You insolent little girl! We will strip your family of everything. We will take this penthouse. We will sue you for defamation and emotional distress until you are living on the street. You do not disrespect the Montgomery name." I did not back down. Instead, I held out my hand. Julian, who had been standing silently by my side, smoothly unzipped his leather folio and handed me a sleek silver tablet. The screen was already glowing with a secondary forensic file I had compiled months ago. The Montgomery name I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue with deliberate mockery. "Let us talk about the prestigious Montgomery name. Let us talk about the generational wealth you love to throw in my mother's face." I tapped the screen, pulling up a series of highly classified financial records. I had spent 18 months tracking Spencer's fraudulent hedge fund, but a forensic accountant knows that money never just vanishes, it always flows somewhere. I had followed the river of stolen cash, and it led straight to the perfectly manicured lawns of the Montgomery estate. "You call us a ghetto black family," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "You march into my home wearing imported cashmere and holding a $2,000 handbag, and you look down on us because you believe your bloodline makes you superior. But I know exactly what your bloodline is worth, Beatrice. It is worth absolutely nothing." Beatrice stiffened, her arrogant mask faltering for the very first time. Richard grabbed her arm, his eyes darting nervously toward the silver tablet in my hands. 10 years ago, I continued reading the data aloud so my parents could hear every single word. 10 years ago, Montgomery Commercial Shipping filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Your husband made a series of catastrophic investments in overseas freight that completely wiped out your family fortune. Your ancestral home in Buckhead was quietly mortgaged to the hilt. Your country club memberships were in default. You were 2 months away from having your luxury vehicles repossessed and facing total social ruin. "That is a lie," Beatrice shrieked, though her voice lacked its previous authority. It sounded thin and panicked. "We are old money, we have trusts, we have endowments." "You have smoke and mirrors," I countered, taking a step closer to them. "Old money ran out a decade ago. You were destitute. And then, miraculously, your son Spencer launched his hedge fund. Suddenly, the country club dues were paid in full. Suddenly you were renovating your estate and buying summer homes in the Hamptons. You told everyone Spencer was a financial prodigy who was multiplying your family investments. Vivian stopped sobbing on the floor. She slowly looked up, her tear-streaked face twisting in confusion as the reality of the situation began to penetrate her delusion. She had worshipped Beatrice. She had viewed the Montgomery family as the pinnacle of high society, the ultimate validation for her golden child Layla. Now she was listening to me dismantle their entire existence. "He is a prodigy," Richard barked, though his forehead was now gleaming with sweat. "Spencer built his firm from the ground up." "Spencer is a parasite," I corrected sharply. "He did not build anything. He stole." "And do you know who he stole from, Richard? He did not target Wall Street billionaires. He targeted hard-working self-made Black-owned businesses right here in Atlanta. He targeted minority contractors, local restaurant groups, and independent tech startups. He promised them high-yield returns to expand their communities, and then he siphoned their life savings directly into his offshore accounts." I watched the color drain completely from Beatrice's face. The aristocratic sneer had vanished, replaced by a hollow, terrified realization that I held their entire lives in the palm of my hand. "Your designer clothes," I said, pointing at Beatrice's cashmere sweater. "Your luxury vehicles. The $2 million retainer you just tried to force my bankrupt parents to pay. Every single dime of your current lifestyle is funded by the blood, sweat, and tears of the very people you just called ghetto. You are not elite. You are a pair of desperate, broke parasites living off the backs of the Black community you despise. You used my parents because they were easy marks desperate for white validation, but you needed the money just as badly as they did." Richard dropped his leather briefcase. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. "We knew nothing about where the money came from," he stammered, backing away toward the elevator. "We just received our monthly dividends from our son. We are innocent investors. You are co-conspirators." I corrected my tone, devoid of any mercy. "Did you really think I would spend 18 months building a federal case against Spencer and simply ignore the massive undocumented wire transfers hitting your personal bank accounts every 30 days? Beatrice let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her throat. She finally understood the magnitude of the trap they had walked into. "I did not just give the FBI Spencer's files," I said, delivering the final crushing blow. "I gave them yours. I mapped out every single stolen dollar you used to maintain your pathetic country club facade. I handed the federal prosecutor a complete trail of your money laundering. Your assets were frozen at exactly 8 o'clock this morning." As if functioning on a perfectly timed cinematic cue, the silence in the penthouse was shattered. Beatrice's designer handbag began to vibrate violently. A sharp, urgent ringtone pierced the air. A second later, Richard's phone went off in his jacket pocket. Then Julian's phone buzzed quietly. He glanced at the screen and offered me a small, satisfied nod. "That will be your wealth management firm," I said, watching Beatrice fumble hysterically for her phone. "They are calling to inform you that your accounts are locked. You cannot pay your mortgage, you cannot buy groceries, and you certainly cannot pay a $2 million retainer for a criminal defense team." Beatrice pulled her phone from her bag, staring at the flashing screen with wide, horrified eyes. She looked at Richard, who was frantically swiping at his own device, his face completely devoid of color. The arrogant, untouchable Montgomerys were crumbling right in my foyer, their entire legacy reduced to dust. Beatrice Montgomery stared at the glowing screen of her phone as if it had just physically struck her. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow wax figure. Richard snatched his own phone from his pocket, his hands shaking so violently that the device nearly slipped from his grasp. The silence in the penthouse was thick and suffocating, broken only by the synchronized chiming of their incoming messages. Automated alerts from their private wealth managers, from their offshore holding companies, from their platinum credit accounts, all frozen, all seized by the federal government. The immaculate mask of high society superiority melted away in a matter of seconds. Beatrice let out a sound that was half gasp and half scream. She turned her wild, panicked eyes not toward me, but toward her husband. "We are ruined!" She shrieked, her voice entirely stripped of its cultured, aristocratic tone. "Every single account is locked, Richard. The Hamptons property, the trust funds, the operational accounts. They took everything." Richard did not try to comfort his wife. He did not offer a steady hand or a reassuring word. Instead, the sophisticated patriarch of the Montgomery family turned into a cornered animal, his face twisted into a mask of pure, selfish rage. He looked at the heavy oak doors of the elevator and then looked back at Beatrice. That stupid, reckless boy, Richard snarled, the venom in his voice echoing off the glass walls. I told Spencer he was moving too much capital too fast. I told him to layer the shell companies better. He is a disgrace to this family. He has destroyed my legacy because he could not cover his own tracks. Vivian, who was still kneeling on the floor, stared up at them in absolute shock. But your son, Vivian stammered, her voice weak and confused. Spencer is in federal custody. You have to help him. You have to post his bail. Beatrice whirled around, her eyes burning with a furious, frantic energy. Help him, she spat, taking a step away from my mother as if Vivian were diseased. He is a grown man who committed federal fraud. We are not going down with a sinking ship. We are going to contact our attorneys, and we are going to sever ourselves from his operations completely. He acted alone. We knew nothing. We knew. The absolute lack of loyalty, the sheer cold-blooded readiness to abandon their own flesh and blood, to save their country club memberships hung heavily in the room. They did not care about Spencer. They only cared about their frozen assets. Richard grabbed Beatrice by the elbow, his grip tight and punishing. We are leaving, Richard commanded, dragging his wife toward the private elevator. Do not say another word to these people, Beatrice. We were never here. Layla, who had been standing frozen near the hallway, suddenly snapped out of her shocked paralysis. She watched the billionaire-in-laws she had worshipped, the people who represented her ultimate high society dream, turning their backs on her. She lunged forward, her designer heels clicking frantically against the marble floor. Wait, Layla cried out, reaching for Beatrice's cashmere sleeve. You cannot just leave me here. I am your daughter-in-law. I am a Montgomery. Beatrice yanked her arm away with such violent force that Layla stumbled backward. You are nothing, Beatrice hissed, her face contorted with disgust. You are a gold-digging parasite who dragged my son down into the gutter with your pathetic, bankrupt family. Do not ever contact us again. The elevator doors slid open. Richard shoved Beatrice inside and stepped in after her, not casting a single backward glance at his weeping daughter-in-law. The heavy, polished doors slid shut, sealing them away and leaving an echoing silence in their wake. Layla stared at the closed doors, her chest heaving as the reality of her situation finally set in. There would be no rescue. There would be no private jets or high-priced defense teams. The country club life was dead and buried. She turned slowly to look at me, her eyes wide and panicked, but I offered her absolutely no sympathy. I just stood beside Julian watching her world burn. When Layla realized I was not going to help her, the gears in her head began to turn rapidly. I could practically see her calculating her next move. If she could not rely on the Montgomery wealth she needed to secure the only safety net she had left, she needed the blind, unwavering devotion of our parents. Layla let out a sudden, ragged sob. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor, her perfectly styled hair falling around her tear-streaked face. She began to crawl across the white marble, dragging herself toward where Calvin was slumped against the kitchen island. Daddy, Layla wailed, her voice breaking into a pitch-perfect display of absolute terror and helplessness. Daddy, please, you have to believe me. I did not know what Spencer was doing. He lied to me. He manipulated me. She grabbed the hem of my father's trousers, burying her face against his leg, weeping with dramatic, violent force. He forced me to make those phone calls, Daddy. He told me if I did not help him get the money, he would divorce me and leave me with nothing. He said he would ruin our family. I was so scared of him. I only agreed to the conservatorship papers because he threatened me. I just wanted to protect you. It was a masterclass in manipulation. She was taking every piece of federal evidence and twisting it to make herself the ultimate victim. And the most infuriating part was watching it work. Calvin, who had just heard his own daughter plotting to declare him mentally insane and steal his life insurance policy, instantly melted. His need to believe in his golden child completely overrode his common sense. He slid down off the bar stool and dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around Layla and pulling her tightly against his chest. I know, sweetheart, Calvin murmured, his voice thick with emotion, stroking her hair as she sobbed into his shirt. I know you would never hurt me. Spencer is a monster. He manipulated my little girl. Vivian immediately crawled over to join them, wrapping her arms around Layla's back. The three of them formed a twisted, pathetic knot of delusion right there on the floor. Calvin looked up over Layla's shoulder and glared at me. His eyes were completely devoid of reason, filled only with venom and misdirected blame. Look what you have done! Calvin snarled, his face red with misplaced rage. Are you happy now, Maya? You chased away her in-laws. You destroyed your sister's marriage. You brought the federal government down on our heads, all because you are a cold, bitter, and jealous woman. You have torn this family apart. I looked at the man who shared my DNA, feeling a profound sense of detachment. He was entirely bankrupt, facing a federal investigation, and comforting the daughter who had actively planned to leave him to die in a nursing home, yet he still found a way to blame me. It was breathtaking in its sickness. Lila lifted her head from my father's chest, wiping a perfectly timed tear from her cheek. She looked at me with a sad, wounded expression, playing the role of the damaged victim to absolute perfection. I forgive you, Maya. Lila sniffled, her voice shaking with manufactured bravery. I know you hate me, but I forgive you. Because unlike you, I actually care about this family. And I have to be strong right now. She turned back to Calvin and Vivian, grabbing their hands and squeezing them tightly. I have to be strong for the baby, Layla announced, forcing a brave, wavering smile onto her face. Vivian gasped, her eyes widening with sudden, miraculous hope. Layla, what are you saying? I am pregnant, Layla whispered, fresh tears spilling down her face. The IVF finally worked. I found out yesterday. That is why I was so scared of Spencer, Mom. I was trying to protect my unborn child. We have to fight this. We have to save the family for the sake of your new grandchild. Calvin let out a choked sob of joy, pulling Layla into an even tighter embrace. Vivian began to weep, praising God and kissing Layla's cheeks. It was the ultimate shield. Layla had played her final trump card, wrapping herself in the protective armor of a highly anticipated pregnancy. She knew they would burn the world down to protect a new Montgomery heir. I felt a slight vibration in the pocket of my blazer. I reached in and pulled out my secure federal mobile device. My team had just finished pulling the final batch of medical records from the private server we had seized from Spencer's home office that morning. I opened the encrypted file, scanning the highlighted medical reports. I let out a soft, humorless laugh that cut through the joyful weeping of my family. The sound was so cold and out of place that Calvin and Vivian stopped celebrating and looked up at me with sheer hatred. Layla turned her tearful, brave face toward me, her eyes daring me to challenge her ultimate victimhood. I looked down at the glowing screen of my phone and then looked directly into my sister's eyes, feeling nothing but absolute pity. Spencer was diagnosed with a severe, irreversible medical condition 5 years ago, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. He has been completely sterile since 2018, Layla. So tell me, who is the father? Layla went completely silent. The theatrical sobbing that had filled the room just seconds before vanished as if someone had flipped a switch. The tears stopped tracking down her cheeks. Her mouth hung open, but the practiced lies she always relied on died in her throat. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that the impenetrable armor of her fake victimhood had just been shattered into a million pieces. Vivian pulled away from her golden child, blinking rapidly. She looked from Layla to me and then back to Layla, her mind clearly struggling to process this impossibility. But Layla and Spencer were undergoing fertility treatments. Vivian stammered, her voice barely a whisper. We paid for the clinic. We saw the receipts. You saw forged invoices, I corrected her, keeping my gaze locked on my sister. Spencer has not been to a fertility clinic in half a decade. So I will ask you one more time, Layla. Whose child are you carrying? Layla scrambled backward on the marble floor, pressing her back against the base of the kitchen cabinets. She looked like a trapped rat, desperately searching for an exit that did not exist. Before she could attempt to spin another web of lies, Julian reached for the smart home remote, resting on the edge of the kitchen island. He pointed it at the massive flat-screen television mounted on the living room wall. The screen flickered to life, instantly replacing the ambient artwork with a stark, high-definition surveillance photograph. I watched my parents turn their heads toward the screen. Calvin let out a sharp intake of breath. The photograph was taken inside a dimly lit VIP room of an underground casino. The timestamp in the corner indicated it was taken just 2 months ago. Right in the center of the frame was Layla. She was wearing a skin-tight red dress, leaning intimately against a large, heavily tattooed man with a thick gold chain resting against his collarbone. He had one large hand clamped firmly around her waist, while she whispered something into his ear with a seductive smile. That man, Julian announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority, is Hector Vargas. He runs one of the most violent and prolific underground lending syndicates in the greater Atlanta area. The federal authorities have been trying to pin a racketeering charge on him for 3 years, and your precious daughter Calvin has been keeping him very close company. Calvin stared at the television screen, his face turning the color of wet ash. He looked down at Layla, who was now trembling so violently her teeth were visibly chattering. "You see, Dad?" I said, stepping out from behind the counter to stand directly over my sister. Layla had a massive problem. She had racked up a crippling gambling debt playing high-stakes baccarat at underground tables across the city. She owed Vargas millions, and she was terrified Spencer would find out and cut off her access to the Montgomery accounts. So she did what she always does. She used her body and her lies to buy herself time. She started sleeping with a notorious loan shark to keep him happy. Vivian let out a muffled shriek, pressing both hands over her mouth. She backed away from Layla as if her favorite child had suddenly caught a highly contagious disease. But sleeping with him was not enough to clear a debt that large. I continued, my voice relentless and steady. Vargas is a businessman. He wanted his money. So Layla made him a deal. She borrowed $3 million in cold hard cash from his syndicate to temporarily cover the holes she had blown in Spencer's fraudulent hedge fund. She needed to keep the Ponzi scheme afloat just a little bit longer until she could successfully declare you mentally unfit and steal the rest of your assets. Layla covered her ears, shutting her eyes tightly, as if that would make my words stop echoing in the room. But Vargas does not hand out $3 million on a promise, I said, turning my attention back to my father. He requires collateral. And since Layla technically owned nothing but the designer clothes on her back, she had to offer him something else. She offered him Montgomery commercial real estate. Calvin let out a choked, agonizing sound. He grabbed his chest again, his breathing ragged and uneven. "What are you saying?" He rasped, his voice barely recognizable. "I am saying she stole your corporate seals, Dad," I told him, delivering the final devastating blow. "She forged your signature on a series of predatory loan documents and put up your 3 flagship commercial properties as collateral for a loan from an underground cartel. She leveraged your entire life's work to save herself from a violent criminal. You do not just owe the banks anymore. You owe Hector Vargas $3 million plus an exorbitant illegal interest rate. And since you are entirely bankrupt and your assets are worthless, he is going to come to collect what he is owed." Layla finally broke. She scrambled toward Calvin, grabbing at his pant legs with frantic, clawing hands. "Daddy, I had to," she screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. "He was going to hurt me. He told me he would break my legs if I did not give him the money. I was trying to save myself. You have to protect me, Daddy. You always protect me." Calvin looked down at the daughter he had worshipped, the girl he had sacrificed my entire childhood to elevate. The absolute disgust and revulsion in his eyes was something I had never seen before. He did not reach down to comfort her. He did not stroke her hair. He violently kicked his leg out, breaking her grip and stumbling backward away from her. "You gave my company to a cartel!" Calvin roared, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated fury. "You gave my legacy to a thug. You are no daughter of mine." Vivian stood frozen against the wall, completely broken. Her high society dream was dead. Her golden child was pregnant with a criminal's baby and had handed their entire fortune over to the criminal underworld. The delusion she had maintained for 31 years had finally crashed down around her, leaving nothing but ruin and ash. Suddenly, a sharp, buzzing sound sliced through the heavy, toxic air of the penthouse. It was the secure intercom connecting directly to the lobby concierge. Julian walked over to the wall panel and pressed the speaker button. "Yes," he answered calmly. The voice of the concierge crackled through the speaker. It was shaking, trembling with barely contained panic. "Mr. Julian, I am so sorry to interrupt," the man stammered. "But there is a situation in the lobby. There are 5 men down here. They are heavily armed, and they are bypassing security right now. They told me to tell you they are looking for Calvin and Layla Montgomery, and they are coming up the private elevator right now." The concierge's voice faded into a terrifying burst of static. Lila remained frozen against the kitchen cabinets. Her fake pregnancy had just been exposed by my revelation about Spencer being sterile, but the sheer terror of 5 armed men coming up the elevator completely overrode her humiliation. She drew her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible. Vivian let out a shrill scream, clutching the marble countertop. "They are going to kill us!" she wailed, her perfectly styled hair now a tangled mess. "Calvin, do something!" Calvin staggered backward, his face slick with sweat. He looked wildly around my penthouse, searching for a weapon, an exit, anything to save his own skin. He was the patriarch who demanded absolute respect, but in the face of actual danger, he was nothing more than a coward. I did not panic. I simply reached across the kitchen island and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner embedded in the marble surface. A soft chime echoed through the room. I engaged my secure federal override. Heavy titanium-reinforced bulkheads slid seamlessly from the walls, locking down the private elevator doors and sealing the emergency stairwell. The penthouse was instantly transformed into an impenetrable fortress. A few seconds later, a series of heavy thuds vibrated through the floorboards. The armed men had reached the penthouse level and were violently throwing themselves against the titanium doors. The muffled sound of their shouting was faint but undeniable. Julian stood beside me, his posture completely relaxed. His phone vibrated against the counter. He glanced at the screen, swiped to accept the call, and routed the audio directly through the penthouse's surround sound system. A gravelly, menacing voice filled the room. "Calvin." The voice barked, dripping with absolute contempt. "My name is Marcus. I work for Hector Vargas. We know you are in there hiding behind your daughter's fancy security system." Calvin flinched as if he had been physically struck. He stared at the ceiling speakers, his chest heaving. "I do not know you," Calvin stammered, his voice cracking. "I do not owe you anything. You have the wrong person." Marcus let out a dark, humorless laugh. "Do not play games with me, old man. Your precious daughter Layla came to us 2 months ago. She was crying about a gambling debt. She needed $3 million in untraceable cash to patch a hole in her husband's fraudulent hedge fund. She signed the papers, Calvin. She used your business as collateral. We hold the paper on your 3 flagship commercial properties." Layla pressed her hands over her ears, shutting her eyes tightly, refusing to look at the father she had just utterly destroyed. Vivian sank to the floor, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "My babies!" Vivian sobbed, completely losing her grip on reality. "You cannot take our buildings. That is our entire legacy. That is all we have left." "You have until midnight," Marcus continued, completely ignoring my mother's hysterical weeping. $3 million transferred into the offshore routing account I just sent to your phone. If that money is not cleared by midnight, we are taking those buildings by force. And if we have to come back up there to collect, we will take a lot more than real estate." The line went dead. The silence that followed was suffocating. Calvin stared at the spot where the elevator doors were sealed shut. His entire identity was wrapped up in his commercial real estate firm. It was his pride, his leverage, the weapon he used to control our family for decades. The realization that Layla had literally signed it away to a violent cartel broke something deep inside him. But instead of holding Layla accountable, Calvin did exactly what he had done my entire life. He turned his rage on me. He spun around, his face purple with unhinged desperation. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. "You have to pay them." Maya, Calvin yelled, spit flying from his lips. You have to fix this right now. I stared at him, my expression completely flat. I do not have to do anything, I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm register. You work for the federal government, Calvin screamed, stepping toward me until Julian smoothly stepped into his path. You have connections. Julian has money. You have millions sitting in accounts you do not even use. You are my daughter. You owe me this. You brought the FBI into this mess. You exposed Spencer's fund. If you had just kept your mouth shut, Layla could have paid them back quietly. If we lose the business, it is your fault. The sheer audacity of his delusion was staggering. He was standing in the home I bought, surrounded by the security system I paid for, protected from the cartel thugs his golden child had sent to my doorstep, and he still believed I was to blame. He still believed my sole purpose in life was to sacrifice myself to save Layla. I looked at Vivian, who was nodding along with Calvin, her tear-streaked face pleading with me to surrender my hard-earned wealth to clean up her favorite daughter's criminal mess. I looked at Layla, who peeked out from between her hands, waiting for me to yield, waiting for me to play the role of the dutiful, invisible scapegoat one last time. I reached forward and pressed the button on the console, dialing the number that had just called Julian's phone. The line rang twice before the gravelly voice answered. You better be calling to confirm the transfer, Marcus growled through the speakers. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the marble island, placing my mouth directly near the microphone. My name is Maya, I said, my tone slicing through the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. You are wasting your time standing outside my elevator. You tell Calvin to send the money, Marcus snapped, completely uninterested in negotiating. He knows what happens at midnight. He signed away his commercial properties, and we are coming to collect. He cannot give you his commercial properties, Marcus, I said, my voice completely devoid of fear. The enforcer on the other end of the line paused. A heavy, uncertain silence stretched through the speaker. I could hear the faint sound of him breathing, processing the absolute confidence in my voice. I turned my head slowly, locking eyes with my father. Calvin's breath hitched in his throat. He watched me with a mixture of confusion and mounting dread. He finally realized that the quiet, obedient daughter he had ignored for 30 years had been playing a game he could not even begin to comprehend. He cannot give you the buildings because he no longer has any equity in them. I continued, leaning closer to the speakerphone so every single syllable echoed through the penthouse. I tracked Layla's fraudulent loans 3 weeks ago. I saw the liens you placed on his firm, so I went through a blind proxy and bought his commercial debt yesterday. The cartel holds absolutely nothing. The buildings belong to me. The heavy silence stretching through the speakerphone felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. Then the voice on the other end erupted. Marcus completely ignored my father and directed his absolute fury straight at me. He told me I was playing a very dangerous game for a stupid little girl. He shouted that paper debt meant absolutely nothing to the cartel. He promised he would blow the titanium doors off their hinges and come into my home to extract every single penny in flesh and blood. The raw violence in his tone made Vivian let out a strangled shriek and press her face against the floor. Calvin began trembling uncontrollably. He grabbed the edge of the marble island, begging me to just pay the men. He screamed that I had millions in secret accounts and that I owed it to the family to save his business. He was sweating profusely, completely unhinged by the reality that his status and wealth meant nothing to the armed men waiting downstairs. Layla was hyperventilating against the cabinets, clutching her stomach and waiting for me to surrender. I stood completely still, refusing to yield an inch. But before I could respond to the cartel enforcer, Julian smoothly stepped forward. He placed his warm, solid hand over mine, gently moving me aside. He leaned down toward the microphone on the console. His posture was completely relaxed, radiating an absolute chilling authority that immediately silenced my screaming father. Julian did not address the man on the phone as Marcus. He knew Marcus was nothing but a low-level mouthpiece. Julian spoke directly to the man he knew was standing right next to Marcus in the lobby. "Good evening, Hector," Julian said, his voice smooth and commanding. "I hope you are enjoying the architecture of my lobby." The voice on the phone faltered. A muffled, scuffling sound echoed through the speaker, followed by a heavy, tense pause. Then a new voice came on the line. It was deeper, darker, and vibrating with cautious anger. The man demanded to know who was speaking and how he knew that name. Julian smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that completely transformed his face. He introduced himself using his full federal title. He announced that he was the lead task force director for the Organized Crime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words dropped into the penthouse like a live grenade. Calvin and Vivian stared at Julian in absolute shock. The man they had repeatedly dismissed as a nobody, the man they had mocked for not coming from old money, was a high-ranking federal director. Julian began to methodically lay out the trap. He explained to Hector Vargas that the federal government had been watching his underground syndicate for 24 months. They knew everything about the illegal gambling dens, the extortion rackets, and the violent debt collections. But Vargas had been smart. He had kept his hands clean by completely isolating his dirty money from his legitimate front businesses. The federal agents had hit a brick wall. They desperately needed a bridge to tie his violent street crimes to a white-collar money laundering operation in order to secure a federal indictment. Julian turned his cold, calculating gaze toward Layla. My sister shrank back against the wooden cabinets, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. Julian told Vargas that the task force was running out of options until a desperate, foolish woman walked into his underground casino 2 months ago. Layla thought she was being clever. She thought she could sleep with a loan shark and use her father's commercial real estate to secure a $3 million loan to cover her tracks. But what Layla actually did was connect the cartel's dirty money directly to Spencer's fraudulent hedge fund. Julian explained that Layla's forged loan documents and her frantic offshore wire transfers were the ultimate smoking gun. She had provided the exact financial bridge the federal government needed. She was the final puzzle piece for the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Layla let out a suffocated, agonizing gasp. She looked at Calvin and Vivian, her eyes wide with undeniable terror. She had not just ruined the family business. She had actively provided the feds with the exact evidence they required to take down an entire criminal syndicate. Her desperate attempt to save her high society lifestyle had doomed them all. Calvin collapsed into a nearby dining chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. Vivian remained catatonic on the floor, completely broken by the sheer magnitude of her golden child's catastrophic failure. On the speakerphone, Vargas began shouting frantically. He screamed orders to his men in the lobby, commanding them to abandon the elevator and get out of the building immediately. The absolute panic in the cartel boss's voice echoed through the penthouse as he realized he had walked his men directly into a massive federal sting operation. Julian leaned closer to the microphone, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "It is entirely too late, Hector," Julian said. Right on cue, the faint, piercing wail of police sirens began to echo through the thick glass windows of the penthouse. The sound multiplied rapidly, growing louder and more frantic by the second, as dozens of federal tactical vehicles swarmed the streets below, completely surrounding the luxury high-rise. Through the open speakerphone, the sounds of sudden violent chaos erupted in the lobby. The heavy thud of tactical boots hitting the marble floor mixed with the booming voices of federal agents commanding the armed men to drop their weapons. There were sounds of a brief violent scuffle, frantic shouting, and the heavy clatter of assault rifles hitting the ground. Vargas let out a furious string of curses before a loud crash echoed through the line and the call went completely dead. The silence in the penthouse returned heavier and more suffocating than ever before. The wailing sirens outside painted the elegant living room in faint, flashing strokes of red and blue light. Julian casually picked up the smart home remote and deactivated the lockdown. The heavy titanium bulkhead slid back into the walls with a soft mechanical hum, exposing the standard polished elevator doors. I looked down at Layla. She was no longer pretending to be a victim. She was no longer crying fake tears or begging for our parents to save her. The reality of her situation had completely crushed her spirit. She was not just facing public humiliation or a messy divorce from a bankrupted fraudster. She was looking at federal racketeering charges, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and money laundering. Layla finally realized that she was going to federal prison for a very long time, and absolutely no amount of crying or manipulation could save her now. The heavy silence in the penthouse stretched for a long, agonizing minute as the flashing red and blue lights painted the walls. I watched Layla closely. The terrified trembling that had racked her body just moments before abruptly stopped. Her wide, panicked eyes narrowed into something hard and vicious. The sweet, innocent facade she had worn like a second skin her entire life peeled away, revealing the ugly, rotting core beneath it. She pushed herself off the kitchen cabinets and stood up straight. She looked from the sealed elevator doors to Julian and then finally locked her gaze on me. A low, bitter laugh escaped her throat. It started small but quickly escalated into a manic, unhinged sound that made even Calvin take a step back. "You always had to ruin everything." Maya Layla spat, her voice dropping its usual high-pitched sweetness and taking on a guttural, venomous tone. "You just could not stand letting me have this. You always had to be the smart one, the capable one, the one who did not need anybody. I hate you. I have always hated you." I did not flinch. I just stood there watching the monster finally unmask herself. "You think you are so superior standing there with your millions and your federal agent boyfriend," she screamed, taking a step toward me, her hands balled into fists. "You think you won. But you have no idea what I have done to you. You have no idea how much of your pathetic life I actively destroyed." Calvin stared at her in shock, but Layla was completely unhinged now, entirely past the point of damage control. Facing decades in federal prison had snapped the final thread of her sanity. "Do you remember those full-ride scholarship letters you cried about missing back in high school?" Layla taunted, her lips curling into a cruel sneer. "The ones from Columbia and NYU. You thought they just rejected you. You thought you were not good enough. I intercepted the mail every single day for a month, Maya. I took your acceptance letters out to the fire pit in the backyard and I burned them. I watched your precious future turn to ash, and I smiled." My breath caught in my throat. I had spent years believing I had failed, thinking I was not smart enough to escape this family. And she had stolen it from me out of pure petty spite. "And your boyfriend's," Layla laughed, tossing her messy hair over her shoulder. "David did not just randomly lose interest in you. I cornered him at a party and told him you were sleeping with your professors. I made sure every guy you ever brought home thought you were a desperate, cheating liar. I isolated you. I made sure you had nothing and nobody because you did not deserve to be happy while I had to constantly pretend to be perfect for them." She gestured wildly toward our parents, her face flushed with pure hatred. I looked at Vivian, expecting to finally see horror in her eyes. I expected her to finally realize that the daughter she had placed on a pedestal was a calculating, malicious sociopath. But the depth of my mother's delusion was a bottomless pit. Vivian scrambled to her feet, wiping her tear-stained face. She moved toward Layla and actually placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "Maya, please," Vivian stammered, her voice trembling with desperate justification. "You have to try to understand. She was just insecure. You were always so independent and strong. You intimidated her, Maya. She did not mean to hurt you. She was just struggling with the pressure of being the eldest. You cannot hold this against her now when she is facing all of this trouble." I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, completely numb. Even after hearing a full confession of premeditated psychological abuse and life-altering sabotage, my mother was still making excuses. She was still demanding that I absorb the pain to protect Layla. The sickness in this family was terminal. It was not just Layla. It was all of them, a perfectly calibrated machine designed to feed the golden child and consume the scapegoat. I nodded slowly, absorbing the absolute finality of this moment. Any lingering shred of hope that they could change any tiny fragment of familial loyalty I still harbored simply dissolved into the cold air of the penthouse. I turned around and picked up my leather briefcase from the kitchen island. I snapped the golden clasps open and reached inside. I pulled out a thick stack of formal legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. I turned back around and tossed the stack directly onto the marble counter in front of Calvin and Vivian. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the stone echoed in the quiet room. What is this? Calvin rasped, staring at the documents as if they were venomous snakes. Those are official legal eviction notices, I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. Since I purchased the debt holding your commercial properties, I am now the sole legal owner of Montgomery Commercial Real Estate. And since you defaulted on the terms of the cartel loan, which I now hold, I am executing my right to immediately seize all physical assets. Calvin stumbled backward, grabbing his chest again. But it does not stop there. I continued, staring directly into Layla's furious, terrified eyes. While Julian was tracking your offshore wire transfers, he uncovered the shell companies you used to hide Spencer's stolen money. The same shell companies that currently hold the deeds to the Montgomery family estate and your luxury townhouse, Layla. They were put up as collateral for Spencer's hedge fund, a fund that is now under federal receivership. Vivian let out a choked gasp, covering her mouth. So here is how this is going to work, I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. The FBI tactical team is downstairs securing the lobby. They are going to escort you out of my building right now, and you have exactly 2 hours to get your things out of my commercial buildings and my properties. Calvin stood entirely frozen on the imported hardwood floor of my penthouse. The sheer magnitude of my declaration hung heavily in the toxic air of the room. I watched his mind frantically searching for an escape route, a way to twist reality back into a shape he could comfortably control. The veins that had been bulging in his forehead during his tyrannical screaming fit slowly began to recede. The furious red flush drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking suddenly hollow and aged. He finally realized that brute force and patriarchal intimidation were entirely useless against me. I was not the terrified little girl he used to banish to her room. I held all the financial leverage. I owned his debt. I owned his buildings. I owned his future. So Calvin did what any seasoned narcissist does when completely cornered. He abruptly changed his tactics. He took a deep, jagged breath, smoothing the rumpled lapels of his custom-tailored suit. His rigid shoulders slumped forward slightly, deliberately diminishing his aggressive posture to project an aura of weary vulnerability. He was slipping effortlessly into a role I had seen him play 1,000 times before, at high society charity galas, on church administrative boards, and during exclusive networking events for the wealthy elite of Atlanta. He was putting on his revered community leader persona. Maya. He began, his voice dropping an entire octave, taking on a smooth, resonant cadence that was specifically designed to soothe and persuade an audience. Just stop for a minute and listen to what you are doing. Listen to what you are saying to your own family. We are not your enemies. We are all you have in this world. I did not blink. I kept my posture impeccably straight and my expression completely unreadable. Julian remained standing silently beside me, a quiet but immovable force observing my father's performance with clinical detachment. Calvin took a slow, measured step forward, holding his hands out with his palms facing upward in a theatrical gesture of surrender. You know exactly how hard I worked to build Montgomery Commercial Real Estate. He continued, his tone dripping with manufactured emotion. I built that firm from the absolute dirt up. I fought tooth and nail in boardrooms where I was the only black man at the table. I broke down barriers, Maya. I created a legacy not just to inflate my own pride, but for you and for Layla. I built an empire to ensure our family would never have to struggle. Vivian, sensing the strategic shift, immediately fell into step beside her husband. She dabbed delicately at her dry eyes with a silk tissue, nodding emphatically. Your father sacrificed his entire life for this family. Maya, she murmured, her voice trembling with practiced sorrow. We are a pillar of this community. People look up to us. They look up to the Montgomery name. We represent Black excellence in a city that demands perfection. You cannot just tear that apart. The hypocrisy of their words was physically nauseating. Excellence. They represented nothing but a toxic illusion. They had spent decades looking down on anyone who did not meet their shallow, superficial standards of wealth and status. My father routinely fired minority contractors to hire cheaper, unregulated labor. He ruthlessly evicted struggling local businesses from his properties without a second thought, all while posing for local magazine covers as a champion of economic empowerment. He only cared about the community when he could use it as a shield to protect his own ego. Calvin saw my prolonged silence and fatally mistook it for hesitation. He pressed harder, leaning heavily into the ultimate emotional manipulation. "The world is hard enough for us black folks, Maya," he pleaded, his voice vibrating with a theatrical passion that would have commanded a standing ovation. "We have to stick together against the forces trying to tear us down. We are supposed to build generational wealth and pass it down to our children. We are supposed to protect our own blood. But look at what you are doing right now. You are tearing down your own family. You are letting petty childhood jealousy destroy everything our ancestors fought so hard to achieve." He pointed a trembling finger toward the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, gesturing broadly to the sprawling city skyline beyond the glass. "If you do this, the community will despise you," he warned, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "They will shun you, Maya. You will be known forever as the bitter, ungrateful daughter who destroyed a black-owned empire just to settle an old grudge. Is that really the legacy you want to leave behind?" The heavy, suffocating silence returned to the room. I let his desperate words hang there, allowing the sheer audacity of his manipulation to fully settle over us. Layla watched me from her position against the kitchen cabinets with wide, hopeful eyes. Her designer dress was wrinkled, and her expensive makeup was streaked with genuine tears of panic. She was desperately praying that this racial and familial guilt trip would finally break my resolve. She had always relied on my parents to shield her from the devastating consequences of her own actions, and she was banking her entire future on them doing it one last time. I looked at the three of them standing together, a perfect, twisted portrait of generational dysfunction. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to establish my dominance. My absolute, unwavering certainty was far more devastating than any screaming match could ever be. "You did not build an empire, Dad," I said, my words slicing through the heavy, toxic air with surgical precision. "You built a facade." Calvin flinched, as if I had physically struck him across the face, but I refused to stop. I took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us and forcing him to look me directly in the eyes. "Do not stand in my home and try to weaponize our race and our community to cover up your colossal failures." I continued, my voice ringing with cold authority. "Generational wealth is not built on massive, fraudulent offshore loans. It is not built on secretly mortgaging your commercial properties to a violent underground syndicate to save your own skin. And it certainly is not built on fraud, fake IVF, and sacrificing one child to feed the ego of another." I turned my attention to Vivian, who immediately shrank back against my father, seeking protection from the truth she had avoided for decades. "And as for representing excellence," I said, gesturing dismissively toward Layla, who was now trembling violently. "Your perfect golden child has been funding a sham lifestyle for years. She has been lying about fertility treatments while siphoning thousands of dollars to cover up Spencer's crumbling Ponzi scheme. Generational wealth is not built on forged signatures and empty bank accounts." Calvin opened his mouth to argue, to spin another web of lies, but the words died completely in his throat. He had absolutely no defense left. His grand, manipulative speech had been thoroughly dismantled and thrown back in his face. "You think you are protecting the Montgomery name?" I asked, delivering the final crushing blow. "You think taking my properties will make me an outcast? You are wrong, Dad. The community already knows." The eviction notices resting on the marble counter seemed to paralyze Vivian. The reality of losing her mansion, her social standing, and her unlimited access to Calvin's wealth was simply incompatible with her carefully constructed universe. Her mind fractured under the weight of her impending poverty. She looked from Julian, standing in my kitchen, to the heavy titanium doors sealing us inside, and then she made her final, most desperate move. She reached into her designer handbag with trembling fingers and pulled out her smartphone. She bypassed Calvin, who was still gasping for air against the dining chair, and ignored Layla, who was suffocating under the reality of federal prison. Vivian swiped across her screen, opening the private streaming application used by the inner circle of her elite Atlanta megachurch. This was a congregation of thousands led by a core group of wealthy, influential socialites who dictated the social hierarchy of the entire city. Vivian hit the broadcast button and instantly transformed. The vicious, calculating woman who had just defended my sister's psychological abuse vanished. In her place appeared a terrified, weeping mother. "Sisters, please, you have to pray for us," Vivian wailed into the camera, her voice perfectly pitched to convey absolute terror and helplessness. "We are trapped. My daughter Maya has lost her mind. She has locked us inside her penthouse, and she will not let us leave. She is holding us hostage. She is threatening to steal her father's company and throw us out onto the street. She has brought armed men to the building. Please, someone call for help. Pray for my family." I watched her perform this grotesque pantomime with a sickening sense of familiarity. This was Vivian's ultimate weapon. She had used public shame to control me my entire life. Whenever I stepped out of line as a teenager, whenever I dared to ask for basic respect or equal treatment, she would drag my perceived disobedience into the light of her church group. She would weaponize the congregation against me, framing herself as the long-suffering martyr burdened with a rebellious, ungrateful child. She knew the crushing weight of public judgment had always forced me into submission. She fully expected that broadcasting this manufactured crisis to her wealthy, pious friends would force me to back down out of sheer humiliation. She held the phone out, rotating it to show Calvin slumped in the chair, and Layla cowering on the floor, deliberately framing them as victims of my supposed cruelty. "Maya has gone completely crazy," Vivian sobbed, her eyes fixed on the scrolling comments of shock and support pouring in from her prayer warriors. "She is trying to destroy our family out of pure spite." Julian shifted his weight, preparing to step in and confiscate the device, but I held up my hand to stop him. I did not feel the old, familiar panic of being publicly shamed. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating resolve. "You want to invite your congregation into our family business, Mom?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm, echoing clearly into her phone's microphone. "You want Atlanta high society to see exactly who we really are. Let us give them the full, unfiltered picture." I picked up the smart Home Master remote from the kitchen island. My penthouse was equipped with an enterprise-grade network designed to handle massive data transfers and secure federal communications. Vivian was connected to my guest Wi-Fi, making her device completely subject to my network protocols. I bypassed her local stream with a few rapid keystrokes, routing her broadcast directly through my main media server. "What are you doing?" Vivian snapped, her weeping facade dropping for a fraction of a second as her screen flickered and went dark. "Give me my phone back." "I am not touching your phone," I replied, keeping my eyes locked on hers. "I am just providing your prayer circle with some essential context." I pressed the final execution command on the remote. Instantly, the massive flat-screen television on the living room wall mirrored exactly what was now broadcasting live to the hundreds of church members currently watching Vivian's stream. I did not cut her feed. I hijacked it and replaced her weeping face with a high-definition security recording from the Montgomery family mansion. The timestamp on the screen clearly read Thanksgiving Day. Vivian gasped, stumbling backward as the video began to play. The footage showed the opulent upstairs hallway of my parents' estate. The audio captured by the hidden corridor microphones was crystal clear. It showed Vivian and Layla engaged in a vicious screaming match. This was the moment Vivian had discovered the truth about Layla's sudden miraculous pregnancy. On the screen, the digital version of my mother was completely unhinged. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure demonic rage. She was not the pious, gentle church leader her congregation knew and worshipped. She was a raving monster. "You stupid, careless little girl," the recorded Vivian shrieked, echoing through the penthouse and simultaneously broadcasting to every elite smartphone in her church group. "You let a filthy street thug get you pregnant. You are going to ruin everything. Spencer will divorce you. The family will be a laughingstock. The recorded Layla was backing away crying and pleading, but Vivian did not stop. The footage showed Vivian lunging forward with terrifying speed. She did not just slap her daughter. Vivian drew back her fist and violently punched her own pregnant daughter directly in the stomach. The raw, sickening sound of the impact was broadcast loudly, followed by Lila's agonizing scream as she crumpled to the hallway floor, clutching her abdomen. The video showed Vivian standing over her pregnant golden child, completely devoid of mercy. "You will fix this," Vivian spat at the sobbing girl on the floor. "You will fix this before you humiliate me." In the present moment, the penthouse was dead silent, except for the horrifying audio looping from the television. I looked over at Vivian. She was staring at her phone screen in absolute paralyzed horror. The live chat on her broadcast had exploded. The initial messages of prayer and support had instantly transformed into a torrent of revulsion, disgust, and sheer outrage. The very people she had relied upon to validate her superiority were now watching her commit a brutal, sickening act of violence against her own unborn grandchild. Vivian's hands shook so violently the phone slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the marble floor. Her pristine high society reputation, her position in the church, her entire social existence was permanently obliterated in real time. She looked up at me, her perfectly manicured exterior completely shattered. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. She was completely hollowed out, destroyed by her own reflection. I stepped out from behind the kitchen island, looking down at the broken pieces of my family. I did not feel an ounce of pity. "You wanted an audience, Mom," I said, my voice steady and completely relentless. "Now they know exactly who you are. Generational wealth cannot buy back a ruined soul. You have exactly 2 hours to get your things out of my commercial buildings and my properties. When the FBI is done with you, my private security team will be waiting to escort whatever is left of you to the curb." Calvin did not move. Vivian remained frozen, staring at the dropped phone. Layla kept her eyes glued to the floor. The untouchable Montgomery Empire had finally been burned to the ground, and I was the one holding the matches. The smartphone dropped on the cold marble floor, suddenly vibrated. The harsh buzzing sound broke the dead silence of the penthouse like a jackhammer. Then it buzzed again, and again. The cracked screen lit up with a relentless cascade of notifications. From where I stood, I could clearly read the bold text flashing across the glowing glass. Pastor Thomas was the first to respond. He sent a message demanding Vivian step down from the ministry board, effective immediately. He called the footage an absolute abomination before God and stated that the church could no longer associate with her or Calvin. A second later, another message popped up. Beatrice, the president of the exclusive Peachtree Country Club, texted to say the ethics committee was convening an emergency vote to revoke the Montgomery family membership. She added a personal note calling Vivian a monster who did not belong in civilized society. The phone screen kept scrolling with sheer unadulterated outrage. People Vivian had hosted for lavish charity dinners, people she had vacationed with in Aspen, women she considered her elite inner circle were now openly calling her a disgrace. The very same women who used to nod sympathetically when Vivian complained about her difficult, rebellious younger daughter were now publicly cutting all ties and expressing their absolute disgust. Vivian dropped to her knees. Her hands hovered over the glowing device, but she was too terrified to touch it. The buzzing was relentless, a continuous physical reminder of her total destruction. The social currency she had spent decades ruthlessly accumulating was evaporating before her very eyes. Every carefully orchestrated charity gala, every generous donation, every perfectly posed family portrait was completely wiped out by 60 seconds of raw, undeniable truth. She had valued her high society standing above the physical safety of her own children. She had built her entire identity on the perception of perfection. Now that standing was entirely gone. She was nothing but a pariah in the city she used to rule. While Vivian was sobbing hysterically over her ruined reputation, and Calvin was staring blankly at the legal eviction notices, Layla made her move. I watched my sister from the corner of my eye. Layla looked at our parents and finally understood that they were completely powerless. They could not buy her way out of federal racketeering charges, and they could not protect her from the devastating consequences of her own massive fraud. They were dead weight. The golden child shield had shattered, and Layla realized she was entirely on her own. She slowly edged along the granite countertops, putting distance between herself and Julian. Her movements were frantic but calculated. She slipped into the hallway leading to the guest suites. I knew exactly what she was going for. Vivian kept a biometric wall safe hidden behind a framed oil painting in the primary guest bedroom. It contained an emergency cache of unmounted conflict diamonds that Calvin had acquired years ago through a shady commercial real estate barter. It was untraceable, untaxed liquid wealth. Layla was planning to run. Minutes later, my sister emerged from the hallway. She was clutching a heavy canvas duffel bag tightly against her chest. She had kicked off her designer heels and was walking in her bare feet to mask the sound of her footsteps on the hardwood floor. Her eyes darted wildly around the room. She ignored the main elevator bank completely. She knew the federal tactical agents were currently securing the primary exits downstairs. Layla headed straight for the kitchen pantry. Hidden behind a set of double doors was the private service elevator used by the catering staff and building maintenance. It bypassed the main lobby entirely and led directly to the underground loading dock. She thought she was being incredibly clever. She believed she could simply slip away with millions of dollars in stolen gems and disappear to a non-extradition country while the rest of her family took the fall for her crimes. She was abandoning them without a single second thought. Layla pressed the call button with a trembling hand. The soft, mechanical hum of the elevator car rising through the shaft echoed in the quiet kitchen. She looked over her shoulder one last time, her face a mask of pure selfish survival. She did not spare a single glance for her mother weeping on the floor or her father gripping his chest in panic. The heavy metal doors of the service elevator slid open with a soft chime. Layla let out a breathless sigh of relief and stepped forward into the empty cab, but her escape was instantly cut short. Julian moved with terrifying speed. He crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides, intercepting her just as she crossed the threshold. He reached out and grabbed her wrist, twisting it behind her back with smooth, practiced efficiency. Layla shrieked in shock, dropping the heavy duffel bag. The canvas bag hit the floor and unzipped, spilling a glittering cascade of velvet pouches and loose diamonds across the linoleum. The stolen wealth of the Montgomery Empire scattered uselessly at her feet. Julian kicked the diamonds aside and forcefully pressed Layla against the steel wall of the elevator cab. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt and snapped them onto her wrists in one fluid motion. The sharp metallic click echoed with absolute finality, sealing her fate. "You are hurting me," Layla sobbed, struggling helplessly against his iron grip. "Let me go. You cannot do this to me." Julian leaned in close. His posture was completely relaxed, but his voice was completely devoid of sympathy. He radiated the cold, lethal authority of a federal director who had finally cornered his primary target. Attempting to flee jurisdiction with undeclared assets, Julian stated evenly, pulling her back out into the bright lights of the kitchen. "That is another 5 years, Layla." The morning sun broke over the Buckhead skyline, casting long shadows across the meticulously manicured lawns of the Montgomery family estate. The pristine tranquility of the exclusive neighborhood was completely shattered by the fleet of heavy industrial moving trucks, idling loudly in the grand circular driveway. I stood silently on the wrought iron balcony attached to the master suite, looking down at the absolute destruction of my parents' carefully crafted illusion. A dozen burly moving men were marching in and out of the massive mahogany double doors. They were not handling the items with the delicate reverence my mother always demanded. They were hauling out custom velvet sofas, imported Italian dining chairs, and absurdly oversized oil portraits, and dumping them unceremoniously onto the damp grass by the curb. Vivian stood on the sidewalk, shivering in a wrinkled silk robe, watching a crew member drag her prized antique grand piano down the stone steps. She was no longer crying. She was completely catatonic, drained of every ounce of her venom and manipulation. Parked just beyond the wrought iron security gates was a dark federal transport van. Through the reinforced steel mesh of the rear window, I could see Spencer. He was slumped on the metal bench wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, his wrists bound in heavy steel chains. The arrogant, charismatic hedge fund manager who had built a fraudulent empire on stolen money and cartel loans was now reduced to a federal inmate awaiting processing. He pressed his forehead against the reinforced glass, watching the estate being picked clean. His fake empire was gone, and his high society wife was currently sitting in a holding cell facing her own decade behind bars. Calvin was pacing erratically near the ruined pile of designer luggage. He was still wearing the same suit from the night before, but it was completely ruined. His tie was gone, his collar was torn open, and his usually immaculate hair was a wild, tangled mess. He looked like a man who had survived a shipwreck only to wash up on a deserted island. He had spent his entire life accumulating power, stepping on anyone who got in his way, and silencing any dissenting voice with ruthless financial force. Now he was watching his legacy get tossed onto the street like common garbage. I did not yell down at them. I did not taunt them or gloat about my victory. I simply stood against the cold metal railing of the balcony, watching them in pure, absolute silence. My presence above them, looking down upon the wreckage of their lives, was far more devastating than any screaming match could ever be. I had not just taken their wealth, I had taken their power, their reputation, and their complete sense of superiority. Calvin stopped pacing. He slowly lifted his head, and his bloodshot eyes found me standing on the balcony. The look on his face was a portrait of total, absolute defeat. There was no rage left in him, no manipulation, no desperate attempts to weaponize race or family loyalty. He was completely hollowed out. He stared up at the daughter he had spent 30 years trying to break, and he finally realized that he had been the architect of his own total destruction. I did not break eye contact. I calmly raised my right hand and gestured to my executive assistant David, who was waiting discreetly by the front doors downstairs. David nodded, stepping out onto the stone portico holding a plain manila envelope. He walked down the long driveway, his sharp leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the pavement. He approached Calvin, who flinched slightly as if expecting a physical blow. David did not say a single word. He simply extended his arm and held the envelope out. Calvin stared at it for a long, agonizing moment before his trembling hand reached up to take it. Vivian slowly turned her head, stepping closer to her husband as he tore the top of the envelope open. Calvin pulled out a few sheets of standard printer paper stapled together in the corner. I watched his eyes dart back and forth as he read the first page. His hands began to shake so violently, the paper rattled loudly in the quiet morning air. Vivian leaned over his shoulder, reading the text alongside him. She let out a soft, suffocated gasp and covered her mouth with her trembling hand. It was not a court summons. It was not a restraining order or a civil lawsuit. It was a 1-year residential lease agreement fully paid in advance. The address printed clearly at the top of the page belonged to a tiny, run-down one-bedroom apartment located in one of the most dangerous, chronically neglected neighborhoods in the city. The building was notorious for broken elevators, black mold, and constant police presence. It was a place where people went when they had absolutely nowhere else to go. For my entire life, Calvin and Vivian had constantly threatened me with this exact scenario. Whenever I wanted to study art or pursue my own independent interests, they would sneer at me, warning me that my rebellious attitude would leave me destitute. They repeatedly told me that without their money and their influence, I would end up rotting in some dangerous slum, completely forgotten by the world. They had used the threat of extreme poverty to keep me terrified and compliant. Now I was giving them exactly what they had promised me. They had no bank accounts left. They had no credit cards, no hidden offshore funds, and absolutely no friends in their high society circles willing to take their calls after last night's spectacular public broadcast. They were entirely destitute. Calvin slowly lowered the paper. He looked back up at the balcony, his lips trembling slightly. He finally understood the absolute finality of the situation. I had not just evicted them from their mansion. I had forcibly relocated them to the exact miserable life they had repeatedly sworn I deserved. I turned away from the railing, leaving them standing on the curb with nothing but a pile of ruined furniture and a lease to a miserable future. 6 months passed like a long, slow exhale after holding my breath for an entire lifetime. The bitter cold of that chaotic morning on the curb dissolved into the bright warmth of a late spring afternoon. The relentless anxiety and the constant defensive posturing that had defined my existence were completely gone. In their place was a profound, unshakable peace. I sat propped up against the plush pillows of a private luxury maternity suite at the top of the city hospital. The room was bathed in soft golden sunlight filtering through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the vibrant Atlanta skyline. The air smelled faintly of fresh lavender and clean cotton, a stark contrast to the sterile clinical smell of typical hospital rooms. Resting securely against my chest, swaddled in a soft pink blanket, was my newborn daughter. She was perfectly healthy and impossibly beautiful. Her tiny chest rose and fell in a steady, soothing rhythm, and her miniature fingers curled tightly around the edge of my hospital gown. I looked down at her innocent face and felt an overwhelming wave of pure, unconditional love. It was a fierce, protective emotion that my own mother had never been capable of giving me. I knew in that exact moment that the cycle of toxic, conditional affection was permanently broken. Julian stood right beside the hospital bed. He reached down and gently pushed a stray lock of hair behind my ear before pressing a long, lingering kiss to my forehead. He did not look like the intimidating federal director today. His shoulders were relaxed, his eyes were soft, and his usual guarded demeanor had completely melted away. He looked down at the tiny life we had created together, and a warm, genuine smile spread across his face. He rested his large hand over my arm, silently communicating a depth of support and partnership that I had once believed was impossible to find. Across the spacious suite, a large flat-screen television was mounted on the wall, playing the local afternoon news at a low volume. I was barely paying attention to the broadcast until a very familiar name cut through the quiet hum of the room. The news anchor was reporting live from the steps of the federal courthouse downtown. I watched as the screen cut to footage of Spencer and Layla being escorted out of the heavy courthouse doors. The bold graphic beneath their images announced their official sentencing. The judge had shown absolutely no leniency. They had both received 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Layla looked entirely unrecognizable. The untouchable golden child who had once flaunted her designer wardrobe and demanded absolute obedience was gone. Her flawless blonde hair was dull and tied back in a messy knot. She was wearing a shapeless, heavy canvas prison uniform, and heavy steel chains bound her wrists to her waist. She kept her head down, trying desperately to hide her face from the aggressive flashes of the press cameras. Spencer walked a few paces behind her, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. They had tried to build a glamorous kingdom on lies, manipulation, and stolen money, and now they were going to spend the next decade and a half locked inside concrete cells. The news segment transitioned smoothly, showing pristine, high-definition aerial footage of the financial district. The anchor began discussing the stunning corporate takeover of the former Montgomery and Hayes empire. The camera panned up the sleek glass exterior of the main commercial skyscraper that Calvin had once considered his crowning achievement. The old brass lettering bearing his family name had been completely ripped down. In its place, shining brightly in the afternoon sun, was the crisp, modern logo of my own private holding company. I had legally absorbed every single legitimate asset they possessed and systematically liquidated the rest. But the most striking image came during a brief B-roll shot of the newly renovated main lobby. The news camera was focused on the sleek new security desk, but my eyes immediately caught a movement in the deep background. A solitary figure was moving slowly across the polished marble floor. It was Vivian. She was wearing a drab, shapeless gray custodial uniform. Her posture was stooped, and her face was heavily lined with exhaustion as she pushed a large yellow mop cart down the long corporate corridor. All her generational wealth and her pristine social standing had completely vanished. To pay the rent on that miserable rundown apartment in the dangerous part of town, she had been forced to take a minimum wage cleaning job working the day shift. She was now performing manual labor in the exact same commercial building that her discarded scapegoat daughter now owned entirely. Calvin, I knew, was working the overnight shift at a local discount warehouse, too broken by his ruined pride to even show his face in the daylight. I watched the screen for another moment, processing the absolute poetic justice of the universe. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or lingering anger. I felt absolutely nothing for them. They were simply strangers living out the consequences of their own cruel choices. I reached for the remote resting on the bedside table and pressed the power button. The television screen went black, and the room instantly fell back into a peaceful quiet. I turned my attention away from the ghosts of my past and looked down at the beautiful face of my sleeping daughter. I had survived their cruelty. I had outsmarted their manipulation, and I had burned down their corrupt legacy to protect my own future. Julian gently squeezed my shoulder, pulling my attention up to his warm eyes. We had built our own empire on a foundation of truth and mutual respect. I smiled, looking at my new beautiful family. The ultimate silent and incredibly sweet revenge was not just destroying the people who had tried to ruin me. It was simply existing in this exact moment, living a brilliant, unbothered, and beautifully authentic life. The greatest lesson I learned from the ashes of my family is that true power does not come from vengeance. Real power comes from walking away from toxic cycles and building an authentic life they can no longer touch. Generational wealth and social status will never replace basic human decency. You must be willing to let go of the people who drag you down to embrace the future you truly deserve. Let me know if you have ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your peace. Share your journey below and subscribe for stories of resilience.